One of the exciting things about being a K through 12 educator today is that if you know where to look, you can find a wealth of primary sources and well-researched, unbiased scholarship to expose students to the rich histories of Africa and its worldwide diaspora. Reputable scholars have shown how and why the institutions of European colonization and slavery in the United States created fictitious narratives that for centuries obscured and distorted Africa's history and represented Blackness as being antithetical to civilization. Using an array of research tools, scholars are recovering enormous amounts of new information about how Africa and its worldwide diaspora contributed to the making of the modern world. Indeed, rising to this challenge is what inspired the founding of the Hansberry Society, a trans-continental network of Black scholars well-versed in interdisciplinary research from history, Egyptology, philosophy and the classics, to archaeology, anthropology, and linguistics. The Society's mission builds on the legacy of William Leo Hansberry, co-founder of the Africa America Institute and the pioneering scholar who created the first college-level courses on African civilizations to exist anywhere in the United States at Howard University in 1922. I invite you to learn from and enjoy a rich conversation with Hansberry Society members Deborah Hurd, Shayla Monroe, and Sewaso Haile Selassie Asefa, three scholars who took time out to share the personal journeys and urgent intellectual questions that inspire their path-breaking research on ancient and medieval Africa. I'd like to start with how the Hansberry Society came about, and then hopefully we'll talk more about each of you and your personal journeys of discovery.
The Hansberry Society was a result of several different encounters. Initially, there were a group of us that would attend the International Nubian Studies conferences in Europe. And it was only a handful of African Americans. So the first time I attended was in 2002. By 2010, we had a group of maybe about 5 people that were attending regularly. And at one point, we were at the British Museum, and Salim Faraji said, we need to form an organization so that when we come to these events, you know, we can get together and talk and try to build something, you know, collectively. And so we had mentioned, oh, we should name it the Hansberry Society. William Leo Hansberry is a very seminal figure, but relatively unknown in the realm of African studies and also ancient African studies. He started at, well, actually, his program actually started in 1920. It's 1921 when he was at Straight University in New Orleans. So he began putting together a program of African studies at that point. So he was talking he was in conversation with archaeologists at Harvard, but he was also going through the archives at the Smithsonian. And this all actually goes back even further. His interest started when he read Du Bois's The Negro. So the Negro, Du Bois actually lays out that African history did not begin with slavery. And that's something that we had been taught in this country, that Africans had no history. And that whole trope or philosophy goes back to the Enlightenment. So you can trace this back multiple generations over in centuries. But William Leo Hansberry's entrance into this was through reading The Negro, where Du Bois basically gives a bibliography of African history up to that point. So there wasn't a lot of records, but he was able to assemble what was known at that time. And William Leo Hansberry was so taken by that he decided that that was what he wanted to do. He wanted to know, how can I get all of these books and begin to read about ancient African history? And he was a freshman at the time. He had just finished his freshman year at Atlanta University, and he talked to his professor, and he was like, "Well, we don't have these books here. The closest place, or the only place that you could probably get access to all of these books, is at Harvard." And so this was during the first week of class. So William Leo Hansberry had gotten this book over the summer after his freshman year and had read it, just devoured it. And so after speaking with his advisor was thinking, "I'm telling you something that you can do later. Like, you can take time later to go to Harvard and read these books." William Leo Hansberry withdraws from school immediately and goes up to Harvard and enrolls and tries to enroll in school. Now, of course, this is unheard of now. You can't just decide, that you're going to leave one school and go to another school. But he actually physically leaves Atlanta to go to Harvard and just shows up and it's like, "Okay, I want to enroll in anthropology." And but he basically knew what he wanted to do at that point. There was a whole objective to him doing that. So once he finishes his first teaching position is at Straight College, which is in New Orleans, and merged and became Dillard University. But while he was there, that's when he begins assembling the materials that would form the foundation of his program of African studies. And then once he goes to Howard in 1922, he actually puts that whole program into action. And so he basically starts a program of study that takes us from, he called it the early tool users, because by the Leakeys had not found the earliest Homo sapien remains at that point. So what was known is that there were early tool users in East Africa. So he starts from there, but he has courses that start from there and go all the way through to contemporary times, which was the 1920s. So he's a seminal figure that is relatively unknown because he spent his whole life teaching at an HBCU. So whereas Melville Herskovitz later becomes known as the father of African studies, he's at Northwestern, which is a predominantly white institution, and he gets all of the fanfare and the glory, whereas William Leo Hansberry, who had started decades before, is relatively unknown within the discipline. So we know that history. And so we wanted to honor him by naming our society after him. The Hansberry Society started basically in the aftermath of the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor murders. And so as a result of all of the social racial reckoning that was happening at the time, those of us who were already knowing each other, we got together and said, well, one thing that we would like to do is ask that the major Egyptology organization in the United States, one, that they issue a statement, because they had not issued a statement at that time of racial solidarity. So we wanted that to happen. But then we also wanted to take the opportunity to discuss diversifying the discipline, because there's still just a few people of color involved in Egyptology and in Nubian studies. So at that point, we wrote a letter asking for certain things to happen. And then after that, I thought and I said, well, we should meet with some other people to decide some strategies for how to implement some of these things that we've asked them to do. Because, we know what we want to happen, but having other people actually implement it or say, oh, well, we don't really know how to do this. It's like, okay, so how about we go about setting about some strategies for implementing some of these demands that we're making? And in the process, we kept finding people. So one of the really good things about the pandemic is that it allowed us to be able to access lectures and webinars of people all the way across the country that we would have never heard of. So in so doing, it was like every week or two, we were finding, you know, who knew that there was a Black zooarchaeologist? Well, I did because I already knew Shayla. But, you know, Black bioarchaeologist. Well, somebody had introduced me to Sawaso, so I kind of knew about her too. But I'm saying all this to say people just started showing up. And, you know, so we were taking notes, like we would be in a, oh, did you see that person? That was a Black woman. Write her name down. Let's email her. So we developed this network within a few months. We have 20 people and, you know, we're still finding people. But we reach out and basically we are just trying to develop networks for people to gain a level of professionalization so that we can actually be in the disciplines and actually make an impact and to do the things that William Leo Hansberry and others after him have wanted to do. So they weren't able to actually access the spaces that we are inhabiting now. But there are issues even in the ways that we inhabit it. So we want to make sure that those that come after us don't have the struggles that we have. So it's a building process.
You know, I have researched and been learning about William Leo Hansberry now for decades. And I never tire of hearing about him. I mean, each time I hear the account, and the one that you just brilliantly gave, Deborah, it's just astonishing. Uh, the impact. You know, I think Du Bois wrote The Negro was published in 1905 or something like that.
Somewhere in there,
Um,
yes.
and Hansberry had grown up. His father died when he was very young, but had left a library of the classics. So, the Negro and its articulation of an African past in antiquity really connected with him because he hadn't seen that in the readings that he had done of the classics, which were all about a particular version of Greece and Rome. But I'd also like to hear from each of you about your personal journeys. You weren't always these vaunted, accomplished scholars. At some point in your lives, you were curious little girls in school, learning about the world, and perhaps this place called Africa, perhaps not. And so I'd like to hear, what were some of those early experiences? Because we've got lots of teachers in the audience who are always searching for ways to light a spark of intellectual curiosity. What was it about? Did you learn anything about Africa? And because Sawaso, I know that you have uh, a perspective on this, being African born yourself. I'll start with you, and then Shayla, I'd like to hear your story, and yours, Deborah.
Sure. Yeah, my trajectory has been a little bit of a zigzag per se. I did grow up in Ethiopia, so from K through 9, my education was in Ethiopia. I took all of the classes in Ethiopia, which included African history, as I thought should be taught. So we learned about the Great Zimbabwe, we learned about Nubia, Axum, we learned about all the prehistory and African history since then. And I thought that was the norm. I didn't like social studies very much in Ethiopia. It involved a lot of reading and a lot of writing, but it was fascinating. And then in ninth grade, my parents migrated to Dallas, Texas. And in Texas, social studies is divided between geography, world history, and then United
Mhm.
States history. And geography didn't necessarily cover much of Africa. Here's the continent of Africa, and that's about all we learned about it. We went to world history, which I was very excited about. This is the time when I will learn stuff that I remember from my childhood. This is going to be great. Um, yeah, African history portion of the world history class didn't involve much of anything. For the most part, it covered the incoming of Islam, and very much focused on the dispersal of Islam throughout Northern Africa. It mentioned Egypt in passing, and we mentioned colonialism within Africa very subtly, and then continued to talk about slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And that was all of the explanation of African prehistory as well as history, which was for me extremely confusing at the time. Well, what is right? The history I learned in Ethiopia, where it involved all this intense reading and intense writing and just a massive amount of information, or this history where, well, there was slavery and there were Europeans, and then we continued to US history. It was very confusing. So I asked a lot of questions that were not very well welcomed within the Texas school system. um, and I asked a lot of questions to my parents. Their answers was focus on the medical stuff and the STEMs. And when I went to
Mhm.
college, of course, I was interested in becoming the doctor. My parents saw me be a medical doctor who healed everyone. I was very excited about it. And then I was also very curious about this African history that I grew up hearing stories from my grandparents. I grew up learning in the school system that all of a sudden didn't exist in the country I was living in. So I started taking African history classes, but they were all limited to the colonial history of Africa and mostly focusing on the 20th century, which again was not what I was looking for. I wanted to hear about the Queen of Sheba, the Aksumite Empire, the Nubian Empire. I wanted to hear about Africa. And what I was hearing about was enslaved populations within America projected as African history. And it still didn't make sense. And I took independent studies, which still most of my teachers, I think at that point in undergraduate, all of my teachers were Caucasian, and I hadn't had an African American professor until my graduate program in Denver. So it was really hard to find the resources to try and bring out that African history that I grew up learning from. So for me, it was very much, was that even real? Or did Africans just make it up to make ourselves feel better, right? And so I questioned myself and my understanding from my childhood a lot. And then I ran into this book by Tamrat that was published in 1972 called Church and State in Ethiopia, which was the massive gateway to African studies for me. I looked into all of the resources he cited, all of the manuscripts that were written in the medieval period, all the way to the present day. I started digging into museums, at which point I realized there is something wrong between the education we're getting in Africa versus the education in the United States. And my research, while I was interested in medicine and health, I started becoming interested in why does that exist? Why is it different that as an African American from Africa, I have these two very distinct and very, very different experiences. I was essentially saying that as a graduate student now, I start putting together that it was not a delusion of Africans to have African prehistory, and that the kingdom of Axum persisted for 1,000 years prior to the Axumite Empire. There are several pre-Axumite societies that led to the Axum. There are societies in Egypt. And the Egyptian empire, like the Egyptian pyramids, were not built by, external sources, but by Africans themselves. Like the Ethiopian civilizations continue to the present day through direct continuity. We see civilizations in Western Africa, in the Senegal and Senegambe. We see civilizations in South Africa, in Central Africa. So the entire continent of Africa is not this made up folklore that is presented by Africans to make ourselves feel better, but rather a very real, tangible history that is often erased in the United States for very specific political reasons. So for me, it's very much reclaiming my own identity and reminding the world that that is real, and it's not a hidden history that is just told by my elders or by the African history teacher who just wants to make me write and read things for the fun of it. And that's what my research is bringing these stories alive and communicating them so others can also understand that this is a very real history before Europeans arrived in Africa, before colonialism. And I do it through bioarchaeology, but I know Shayla will tell us how she studies all of this through zooarchaeology as well. For me, it's bringing the African story back to life.
Thank you. That was so evocative. But before we hear from Shayla the scholar, I want to hear about Shayla, the young schoolgirl.
As a young girl, I was really curious and I read a lot. I was placed in what they called at the time gifted and talented education, which oftentimes meant teachers left us to our own devices. So I remember I read the biography of Cleopatra in the 6th grade as my independent project. And in the 7th grade, I read the biography of Nefertiti. I was already drawn to Nile Valley history. That wasn't what I wanted to do with life, but because of our curriculum, the type of school that I went to, I had the freedom to explore those things, even if it wasn't really discussed, or it definitely didn't come on behalf of the school. They were just kind of like, well, if that's what you want to spend your time on, that's fine. And then in the 8th grade, my family joined, I guess what I can only describe as an Afrocentric Christian church. It was super Afrocentric. So in Bible study on Wednesdays and in church on Sundays, I was getting all the African history from my pastor. He talked about everything, and we had a sister church in Ghana. And so I grew up in a church that constantly reinforced that Africa had this beautiful history and that Africa was and is beautiful. None of that was really reflected in school, but as I changed schools and went through the school system, of course that created a conflict, because I went to school knowing that Africa was everything. And And I would challenge, my teachers, not in a disrespectful manner, but I had a certain perspective on things and I could see the absence. And when my colleagues and classmates, even my Black classmates, would denigrate African history, African people, and ourselves, I was in a position where I could say, oh, this is straight ignorance. You just don't know. No one's ever taught you.
So fascinating. And even your Afrocentric church experience is just one among many examples of centuries of Black parents and teachers and communities taking the initiative to provide educational settings that provide alternative narratives to the mainstream folklore, as Sawaso called it, that was created by the Imperial Project. Deborah, what was Deborah, the little girl's experience in school?
When I started, and I guess I should say that one thing that we should never discount are the very first teachers that we have, and those are parents, grandparents, elders. Those are our first teachers. So when I did not start school until first grade. So up till first grade, I was always at home, and I was at home with my great great aunt. She was my great grandmother's sister. She was born in 1901. I should say that I am celebrating an anniversary this year. I realized that right after Labor Day, I started school 50 years ago. So this is my 50th anniversary. But up to that point, I was at home with that great aunt. And she had lived through some of the most transformative times in history. And so I literally sat at her feet in the African tradition, uh, listening to these stories and just absorbing all of that history. But I went to a HBCU, I went to Tennessee State University, I got a degree in political science. I wanted to be a lawyer. I wanted to have a Jaguar. I wanted my house with the white picket fence and my 2.5 kids. That's what I wanted. And so it is funny when I think about it, because even after I left Tennessee State, I still had that dream when I went to law school. And they're there in New Orleans, at Tulane, which is uptown New Orleans, where the mansions are. That is where I had my awakening amongst the wealth of upper class New Orleans, and a few blocks the other direction were the projects. And I recognized that something was wrong there. And as I began to reflect, I remember the seminal moment was during the second year of law school. One of my friends at Washington, he called me up and said, Deborah, Kwame Ture is speaking over at Dillard. Do you want to go? I said, okay, sure. And that Kwame Ture blew my mind. That's all I can say. I was never the same after that. And I started frequenting the Black bookstore, community bookstore. And that was the switch. I ended up deciding that I wanted to work in the Napatan, the Kushite period, because they actually had text and archaeology. So I could combine all of these years of study of translating text. I could use that as well as the archaeology. But like I said, it wasn't a straight path, but all along the way, I could see little seeds. I got a medal, a key, my junior year of college, for being in an honor society. And I used to wear it around my neck, and I looked at it one time, and it had the Egyptian god Jehudi, the god of wisdom. And at the time, I was just like, oh, this is interesting. But after I got into it, I was like, wow, this is Jehudi. This means something to me now.
Sewasu, what Deborah has been describing, this journey toward, that she says is circuitous, but it sounds to me as though it was preordained as well. You've told us some of your journey, and I can see now how you combined what you thought was going to be your original direction was to be a doctor, uh, and focusing on STEM into a different, rich vocation. And I'm aware that some of your focus is on health and nutrition practices in antiquity. Can you say more about that? And I'd also be curious to know uh, whether or not you see any relevance. I know that you were a scholar of the ancient past, but you live in the here and now, and so I'm curious to know whether there are ways that you connect your research passion to contemporary challenges that we're facing.
Yeah, of course. To start with your first question, so for me, yeah, I wanted to be a medical doctor, make my parents proud. Every African parent, I feel like, wants their children to be a medical doctor. At least that's the stereotype, and my parents definitely wanted that. So I started on the medical track. Um, I did internships in undergrad. I took all the biology and chemistry classes to qualify for the medical school application. And then at one point, I interned with a surgeon, at which point I thought, oh my God, there are a lot of liquids and a lot of soft tissues. I don't want to be part of this. This is not what I want. So I took a physical anthropology osteology course. This was, I believe, junior year of my undergrad. And I thought, this is awesome. This is great. No fluids, no tissue, but all of the anatomy and all of the health. This is what I want to do. And I took another class and another class. And before I knew it, I was an anthropology major, and I could combine the history and the ethnography and the storytelling aspect that I was so interested in with the other part of things that I'm interested in of health and nutrition and people's lives. And it was a magical, almost like ordained, as Deborah said, combination of the two things that I really, really like that came together. So as a bioarchaeologist, I use archival texts to contextualize the skeletal remains that I see and the pathologies that I see on the bones. And I try to also talk to people if it is a historical period, if it is if I'm researching information about people that is that their lives are still within the society's memory. And I put all of these together to understand how the people lived, how the social, political, and economic environment that they lived in affected them, and how their health outcome came about to be, and how that relates to their identity as a person in the greater fabric of our society. So that then connects to its present day relevance, which to me is very much talking about equity and people's experiences with it because of like their social positionalities. So
Mhm.
with my research on diet and health, I look at what is called now the social determinants of health, which looks at the factors that are outside of biology that result in differential health outcomes. So it's access to education, access to clean living environment, access to health care, and to nutritious diet. So it comes back to this equal access to nutritious dietary resources, to equity in healthcare, to less disenfranchisement for individuals whose identity puts them in a less privileged position in society. So for me, it's also informing policies in the present of how we can learn from the past about the results of inequities and the results of um, disenfranchised populations to support populations that are disenfranchised today, to promote policies that influence better distribution of resources, better access to nutritious foods and healthcare, and healthy environment and healthy housing climate, I guess. So for me, it's very much the past informs the present, and the past and the present are not two distinct things. They're a continuum, and the past continues to feed into how we get to the future. So if we don't deal with like the injustice of the past today, we're not going to get to a better tomorrow. So for me, it's about connecting the past to today so we can get to a better tomorrow.
Who are the people you are studying in the past, and where are they? Just so we can see how long that continuum is.
Yeah, so within the African context, my research focuses in north central Ethiopia in the highlands, about 3,000 meters above sea level. And I focus on the medieval period from about 1270 to 1508 AD. And the past continues from the Aksumite Empire. At least for me, it begins with the Aksumite Empire of the 1st century AD, and the political and social history of Ethiopia continues all the way to the present. And the Solomonic Empire, which the population that I'm studying is a part of, the Solomonic Empire continued from 1270 until the Derg administration in the 20th century came about in the 1974. So for the populations that I study, there is this fully alive social memory of continuity that's also supported by the archaeology. So there is this direct connection of the social and the historical dynamics, as well as how economy was played about through identity. So within the populations that I'm studying, your identity of religion, the identity based on the languages they spoke, what area they come from, whether they live within a rural or a more urbanized area, their relationship to the ruler population, their role, their place within the political hierarchy of the country, all intersect to influence their access to various resources. So I bring in all of this context from the written records, from historical manuscripts. And for me, I focus in looking at their access to land, because land ties together with their access to food, because it's an agricultural society. It also ties in with their political power within the society. So I focus on their access to land. And unfortunately, in the present, we are still seeing conflicts rising in Ethiopia because of land. So this is a very real historical trajectory that we continue to deal with as a nation and as a people to the present day, is that access to land still ties in with access to resources. And I look at health in the medieval period by tying it to diet, because less nutritious food results in more stress on the human body, which we can observe from the bioarchaeology and from the skeletal remains. I also use isotopic analysis to look at, to differentiate between environmental stress. For example, if there was a drought or failure in crops in one time period versus individuals had sociopolitical stressors that resulted in their inability to access nutritious and enough sufficient food for them to be able to be healthy and productive parts of society. So it's a little bit of a cross section of archival research with the bioarchaeology and anatomical study of the human body, and then connecting that to this long historical continuum of social hierarchy.
That is fascinating. So you opted for medieval bones, to be in the lab with medieval bones.
Yes.
And I know, Shayla, you decided that you wanted to focus on people who were dealing with animals, or perhaps more the animals in antiquity. So this is a good way for me to probe what you're compelling. What are the research questions that keep you up at night?
So I became an anthropology major at Howard. Anthropology has four main subdisciplines, which is linguistics, archaeology, sociocultural anthropology, and biological anthropology. And I thought for a while I would be a biological anthropologist like Salasa. And my professor, Mark Mack, our osteology lab, which was the lab he inherited from Michael Blakey, there was just a little poster or a little like sheet tacked onto the wall that had a Hansberry quote. And the quote said something to the effect that we couldn't know ourselves until we understood the history of the continent of Africa, meaning us being African Americans wouldn't truly know ourselves until we had studied the African past. And so we went into the lab every day, and this was just on the wall. And so I always thought that whatever I ended up doing when I decided to become a scholar would be somewhere in that tradition. I didn't think I would be doing it as a zooarchaeologist. However, zooarchaeologists, especially one like me who's trained as an anthropologist, my questions are always human in nature. So there's a separate discipline, archaeozoology, where they just might study animals in the past for the animal's sake. I am always trying to get at questions that are human in nature because of my anthropological training. So I have studied the interactions between hunters and herders in the Nile Valley Neolithic. My dissertation has focused on the relationship between herders and Egyptian colonists at the fortress of Asku at the Second Cataract. And in both cases, I'm trying to use the animal bones, which animals are there, whether those animals were hunted or raised or perhaps gifted or traded, how old the animals were when they were culled, whether or not they were cooked by some sort of human culinary processes, how they were cooked. I'm trying to use as much information as I can extract from the bones to speak about human behavior, how humans are managing their food, and how the management of that food affects how people are interacting with one another. So for me, even though I study the relationship between humans and animals, the central questions always come back to, what type of decisions are people making in their environment? How are they navigating harsh climates, changes in climate, and also combinations of political factors and environmental factors that, have to be assessed because, at the end of the day, humans like to eat food, they like to survive, and humans tend to make smaller humans that cry if you don't feed them every day. So at the end of the day, people are always making decisions. And I'm looking at the final evidence that the evidence found in animal bones to try to figure out how people are navigating the challenges of living and existing and thriving in their environment.
And is there a present day challenge that you think your research, and you can also give us the period that you're focusing on, and it's the Nile Valley. Is there any relevance if someone said to you, why do you care about that? I mean, what does that have to do with all that we're confronting today? What would you say to them?
Well, my dissertation research focuses on the Nubian Sea Group during the Middle Kingdom up into their archaeological disappearance somewhere during the New Kingdom. So somewhere around 1550 BC. We can't see them anymore in the archaeological record. So this is a group of cattle pastoralists who existed on the margins of two states. You had the Egyptian state and you had the Kerma state. And this group of people, even though they're interacting with both state governments, is really beholden to no one. They're transhuman, which means most of them, not all of them, would move seasonally with their cattle. And the way that they interact with these two state governments, while also crossing boundaries and kind of doing their own thing, is incredibly relevant to the plight of modern day pastoralists on the African continent. Cattle pastoralism on the African continent goes back to at least 6500 BC. That's how long people have been moving across the landscape with their cattle. So the boundaries that were put in place, and, in the 1940s, are really absurd when you think about how many thousands of years people have been transversing the Nile Valley, the Atbara, moving back and forth across the Sahel. When you think about how many thousands of years people and cattle have moved across this landscape, and then boundaries put in place in the 1940s and the 1950s stop the movement of those people from moving from across an arbitrary barrier. So my heart is always just kind of with the pastoralists who have political challenges, who face political challenges all across the Sahel and in East Africa, based on these arbitrary boundaries. And the coda to this is that as our climate changes, the climate in Africa has always changed, and sometimes those changes are more dramatic than others. But right now, the continent of Africa is losing arable land that it cannot afford to lose. Pastoralism is traditionally a dry land adaptation. So even though some people believe that pastoralism is destructive, pastoralism is a very useful adaptation for people who don't have arable land, but they do have scrub and brushland that they can use to feed those cows and create a viable lifeway. So on a continent where the amount of arable land, the amount of farmable land is shrinking, we have to rid ourselves of colonial biases against pastoralists, because most of the biases that we see against pastoralism, those came in with the British. Wherever the British went and couldn't control pastoralists by making them stay in one place and pay taxes, you have this scientific early anthropological literature that says all of these negative things about cattle pastoralists, how they're destructive, how they're violent, this, that, and the other. Even now, throughout Tanzania, throughout Kenya, throughout parts of Ethiopia, you will hear African people who have inherited a negative point of view about pastoralists, and they inherited that point of view from these early British socioanthropologists who really just didn't like people who don't stay still and pay taxes. So in order for us to kind of properly assess the future of pastoralism, as African and African descended people, we have to examine the vestiges of colonialism in our perspectives and tease that apart from the actual science. Because right now, science can tell us more about the uses and the possibilities for accommodating pastoralists than, you know, E. Evans Pritchard and, you know, his little self, who was, you know, really just trying to get those taxes, right? So in terms of the migration, from about 6200 BC, once we have the influx of both tourists into the African continent, we start to see complexity all throughout the Sahara, especially in the central part, and these people are moving. So what we think of as barriers, meaning, okay, people lived in the Nile Valley and then they just stayed there, or people lived in the Red Sea Hills and they just stayed there, or people lived in the Central Sahara and they just stayed there. These boundaries are arbitrary projections onto the past. These people were moving. We can tell from their fauna, their remains, all of their stuff. These people are moving great distances.
We are at a period where we're really realizing that we need to break down the barriers between the disciplines and begin looking at the evidence that we get from these compartmentalized, you know, these are the bioarchaeologists studied this, but they study it in isolation in this particular region, and the region of the Sahara. People who are investigating the Sahara are not in conversation with the people who are in the Nile Valley, because Egypt is separate and is special and spectacular all of its own. It has no relationship to any other part of Africa, you know? And so I think that part of us being in the discipline is raising those questions that, you know, have been ignored for a long time. Like, what are the relationships between the ancient Egyptians and the people in the Sahara and the Nubians and the Ethiopians? Who are these people? How are they migrating? How are they using the landscape? How are they interacting with each other? And so we are those people that will start breaking down those barriers by asking those questions and utilizing all of the evidence to try to answer these questions.
You call to mind the spat between William Leo Hansberry and his professor, George Reisner, the noted Egyptologist who claimed that Nubians were a kind of Caucasian, which was understood to be white, and how Hansberry challenged him in class. And look how far we've come. And then, Shayla, I would suggest to you that the we that Hansberry is referring to in that quote that you had on the wall was the people of Africa and its worldwide diaspora, but all of humanity. My sense is that Hansberry was looking to challenge the entire epistemology of humanity and our origins and our civilizations and the creation of the modern world.
There was a history of women ruling in different parts of Nubia throughout its history. But my dissertation is looking at, what does the ruler say or portray as being the things that a good ruler does? Because the point that I'm making is that even though people are in power, even if you have a ruler, you have a president, you have a dictator, no one ever has total, absolute power. They may portray themselves as having absolute power, but no one ever has total, absolute power. If all of the people unite against the ruler, that ruler loses power. So the ruler has to either show that they portray themselves as being all powerful, or they also, what are some other ways that rulers maintain power? Well, if you want to maintain the goodwill of the people, you have to do things for the people. So what are the things that a good ruler does for the people? So that's what I'm looking at when I'm looking at the sides of these temples and looking at the iconography and inscriptions. What are the things that the ruler does for the gods, so that the gods continue to bless the Kushite people? But also, what do the rulers do for the people so that they feel a part of the nation and that they are, comfortable and continue to, not want to rebel, because that's basically what happens when your people are not happy. But so throughout looking at Kushite history, though, you cannot ignore that the Kushites had a veneration for women. And so that's one of the things that I think you have to look at, that kind of, it makes us think about where we are today with womanhood. How are we relating with women? How do we appreciate Black women? So there is a history of ruling women, and you see them portrayed on the sides of temples. They're big women. So even what's considered beautiful, so you would have European Egyptologists call them fat. And it's like, no, because what you mean by fat is something that's is something negative. These women were voluptuous. They were powerful. They were beautiful. So you would have women that would be on the sides of a temple holding the prisoners by the hair and holding the mace in the other hand like they're getting ready to strike. But they're not portrayed as men. So when you think about in Egypt, when you have Hatshepsut, when she takes power, sometimes she has to portray herself as a man because they aren't really sure what to do with the ruling queen that calls herself a pharaoh, because the pharaoh is supposed to be the living Horus. And Horus is male. So how do you account for this woman? So sometimes Hatshepsut portrays herself as male to try to fit in with that, the whole ruling ideology. But you don't have that in Kush. So these women are in battle mode, but they got their shawls, they're wearing their dresses, and they've got the dagger nail. So they've got you have never seen a manicure until you've seen a Kushite queen holding her mace with nails that are out to here. So it's like, I can be a woman, I can be powerful, I can fight, but I'm also respected. And so when we think about, Black women today, Black women who are assertive, who are trying to lead, are seen as being pushy, they're aggressive, they're loud, they're mean. And it's like, that is not how you portray us. We've always been powerful. We've always been having authority. We've always had our respect. So part of what I think that is relevant for us is looking back and seeing how in ancient times, men and women, African men and women, they got along. There was no, having a ruling queen, a woman in authority, did not diminish manhood at all. And men respected their women. So you would see, when you see the Takamani and the Manatore, they're a ruling couple, and it's always fascinating to see. It's like you can see that they are both equally powerful. They have mutual respect for each other, and you can see that the people had respect. They were people that built. So they built a lot of temples, they built a lot of structures around the country, but they had the respect of the people. So going back to that understanding, I mean, how African women are is a historical type thing, and it's cultural, and it's nothing for us to be ashamed of. We should not have to uh, dampen down our exuberance or our whatever just to fit in. This is who we are. This is who we've always been. This is how we get along in the world. And so understanding those cultural differences, how they're tied to our history, being able to preserve those historical ties, but also getting back to the essence of the respect between men and women. I think that is probably the biggest takeaway, or the biggest lesson that we can learn from the ancient times. Just being able to respect and honor our women.
This has been such a rich conversation. All things must come to an end. Good things must come to an end. And but before we do, I just want to give each of you 3 seconds thinking about the theme of recovering Africa in antiquity and the Middle Ages and its extraordinary contributions to the modern world, and what kinds of inspirations young people, children, teenagers in school, what kinds of experiences, intellectually and otherwise, can lead them on this journey to Africa. Just a 3 second thought about that.
Challenge early scholars. Some of these European scholars did not have our future or the truth at heart when they came up with different categories and different narratives. So challenge that early scholarship, learn it through and through, challenge it, improve upon it, and also travel. If you get the chance to travel throughout the diaspora and meet your brothers and sisters in different areas, you will not regret it.
And that's a message that can apply to students and teachers. To get to know the material, you got to be a scholar yourself as a kindergarten teacher. Deborah, you want to give us your 3 second gem?
I would say to just read and be curious. That's the entry point, is that curiosity. Don't ever stop being curious. Don't ever stop asking questions. Once you find your niche, the thing that really excites you when you're reading about it, then continue to follow that, because that is the thing that will continue and sustain you, whether you go into this as a profession or if it's something that you just do on your off time. You will do this for the rest of your life. It will be something that will sustain you in your dark times. So when you're depressed, when the world seems to be going crazy, you can go and get your book and escape into some long hidden past that you didn't know about. But take that information and then share it with others. It's about we will call it an intergenerational transfer of knowledge. So share the knowledge with others. Be willing to share, especially with the younger. So if you're an elder, share with the children. If you are somewhere in the middle, be willing to share with elders and with children. But we have to make sure that this knowledge gets out, so that it not only transformed, because it's transformed our lives, as you can tell, but we want to make sure that it transforms the lives of the next generation.
Sawaso?
For me, yes, seek it out. It's out there. It's the origin of everything. So go find it and be proud of it. It's as an African American, it's where we come from. It's who we are. It's part of us, and it's a never-ending well where you keep on learning and you keep on loving it, and it just creates a different universe than the universe that's given to us within the United States. So keep seeking it out, keep finding it because it's a joyful universe, and keep questioning it, and just keep diving further and further. And if you can't find anything, you can create it. So go seek it out and find the evidence, find what everybody else haven't found or shielded, and just make it your own because it is your own.
Thank you all. This has been wonderful, and I do look forward to the sequel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maura.